Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems. The ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? What is this strange thing, this strange idea, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to? But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, mind spinning and emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Sleepy Time Tales is intended to be used as a distraction to what keeps you awake at night, or sometimes background noise or company. That's why I make these episodes quite long, so that I'm here for you without any pressure of the end coming. Now, as far as I know, there are a couple of different ways to engage with the show. The primary idea is that it gives you something to focus on, a story or an event that lets you keep your mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxieties, to give it just enough focus not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep when it comes for you. The second way is some people might just want some kind of background noise. Maybe the sound of the ocean, wind in the trees, sound of the rain, just regular white noise, or maybe just some boring dude droning on in the background. But as you're listening, make sure you don't try to force the sleep. Keep a light mental grip on the thread of the story and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, I'm hoping that you're asleep before I get to the end of the episode. But it's important, especially when you're just joining us, not to feel pressurized. This probably won't work if it's your first night. It'll probably take a solid 3 nights or so to get used to the strangeness of this whole idea of listening to someone who's going to speak to you in your sleep, or maybe to get used to my accent, or maybe get used to the types of story that I tell. It's also possible that early on at least one episode isn't long enough. Or related to that, maybe you actually don't have trouble going to sleep. Maybe you wake up in the middle of the night. What I recommend in both these cases is that you download a whole bunch of episodes into your podcatcher of choice. Put them in a playlist, start on the latest episode, and then let yourself drift off. And then when you find yourself lying awake at night, you can pop your earbuds back in or carry on listening, however you're doing it, and just drift off to sleep again. You can even do the same thing if you wake up before your alarm, 60 minutes or as little as 30 minutes. Do the same, carry on listening, go back to sleep. And you may wonder what the point is. What's an extra 60 minutes or 30 minutes of sleep in the context of a whole night? But I've had people actually thank me for suggesting this to them, because there is something about allowing yourself complete relaxation right before the alarm that's satisfying on a whole new level. So relax and enjoy this, because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. Before we get on with the show, I'd like to ask for a couple of minutes of your time. If you'd like to support Sleepy Time Tales, to help me keep it going to thousands of insomniacs just like you, please consider supporting it on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is a monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can also get you fun bonuses based on how much you contribute. There are bonuses available from as little as $2 a month. And $5 a month gets you a whole bunch of cool stuff that I think many listeners would enjoy. So go and take a look and see what grabs you. And if monthly support is a little bit much to ask for, which I completely understand, there is the tip jar on the website, which you can throw a few dollars in every now and then whenever you're so inclined. I've also got some merchandise up on TeePublic, which you can also read through the show notes or via the website. There's some Halloween-themed designs up there at the moment so that you can get shopping for spooky season. Most of the items aren't even Sleepy Time Tales branded, so no need to explain to people what it is, unless you've decided to spread the word. And speaking of which, while money is very handy, another way to help the show is just simply to help it grow by telling people about it. If you know someone who struggles with sleep, just mention to them that you find Sleepy Time Tales helpful, and maybe it'll work for them. So you can help me to do my small part, to do our small part in improving people's lives. And if you tell people on social media, make sure to tag me in. That's at Sleepy Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter so that I can see and I can say thanks. And of course, I've got to shout out the music, which is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. Their work is available on their website at loyaltyfreakmusic.com. Thanks for taking the time. Let's get back to the show. We return this week to On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection by Charles Darwin. There is one point connected with individual differences which seems to me extremely perplexing. I refer to those genera which have sometimes been called protean or polymorphic, in which the species present an inordinate amount of variation, and hardly two naturalists can agree which forms to rank as species and which as varieties. We may instance rubus, rosa, and hericium among plants, several genera of insects and several genera of brachiopod shells. In most polymorphic genera, some of the species have fixed and definite characters. Genera which are polymorphic in one country seem to be, with some few exceptions, polymorphic in other countries. And likewise, judging from brachiopod shells, at former periods of time. These facts seem to be very perplexing, for they seem to show that this kind of variability is independent of the conditions of life. I am inclined to suspect that we see in these polymorphic genera variations in points of structure which are of no service or disservice to the species, and which consequently have not been seized on and rendered definite by natural selection, as hereafter will be explained. These forms which possess in some considerable degree the character of species, but which are so closely similar to some other forms, or are so closely linked to them by intermediate gradations, that naturalists do not like to rank them as distinct species, are in several respects the most important for us. We have every reason to believe that many of these doubtful and closely allied forms have permanently retained their characters in their own country for a long time. For as long, as far as we know, as have good and true species. Practically, when a naturalist can unite two forms together by others having intermediate characters, he treats the one as a variety of the other, ranking the most common, but sometimes the first one described as the species, and the other as the variety. But cases of great difficulty, which I will not here enumerate, sometimes occur in deciding whether or not to rank one form as a variety of another, even when they are closely connected by intermediate links. Nor will the commonly assumed hybrid nature of the intermediate links always remove the difficulty. In very many cases, however, one form is ranked as a variety of another, not because the intermediate links have actually been found, but because analogy leads the observer to suppose either that they do now somewhere exist, or may formerly have existed. And here a wide door for the entry of doubt and conjecture is opened. Hence, in determining whether a form should be ranked as a species or a variety, the opinion of naturalists having sound judgment and wide experience seems the only guide to follow. We must, however, in many cases decide by a majority of naturalists, for few well-marked and well-known varieties can be named, which have not been ranked as species by at least some competent judges. That varieties of this doubtful nature are far from uncommon cannot be disputed. Compare the several floras of Great Britain, of France, or of the United States, drawn up by different botanists, and see what a surprising number of forms have been ranked by one botanist as good species, and by another as mere varieties. Mr. H.C. Watson, to whom I lie under deep obligation for assistance of all kinds, has marked for me 182 British plants, which are generally considered as varieties, but which have all been ranked by botanists as species. And in making this list he has omitted many trifling varieties, but which, nevertheless, have been ranked by some botanists as species. And he has entirely omitted several highly polymorphic genera. Under genera, including the most polymorphic forms, Mr. Babington gives 251 species, whereas Mr. Bentham gives only 112, a difference of 139 doubtful forms. Amongst animals which unite for each birth and which are highly locomotive, doubtful forms, ranked by one zoologist as a species and by another as a variety, can rarely be found within the same country, but are common in separated areas. How many of these birds and insects in North America and Europe, which differ very slightly from each other, have been ranked by one eminent naturalist as undoubted species, and by another as varieties, or, as they are often called, as geographical races. Many years ago, when comparing and seeing others compare the birds from the separate islands of the Galapagos archipelago, both one with another and with those from the American mainland, I was much struck how entirely vague and arbitrary is the distinction between species and varieties. On the islets of the little Madeira group there are many insects which are characterized as varieties in Mr. Wollaston's admirable work, but which it cannot be doubted would be ranked as distinct species by many entomologists. Even Ireland has a few animals, now generally regarded as varieties, but which have been ranked as species by some zoologists. Several most experienced ornithologists consider our British red grouse as only a strongly marked race of a Norwegian species, whereas the greater number rank it as an undoubted species peculiar to Great Britain. A wide distance between the homes of two doubtful forms leads many naturalists to rank both as distinct species. But what distance, it has been well asked, will suffice? If that between America and Europe is ample, will that between the continent and the Azores, or Madeira, or the Canaries or Ireland be sufficient? It must be admitted that many forms, considered by highly competent judges as varieties, have so perfectly the character of species that they are ranked by other highly competent judges as good and true species. But to discuss whether they are rightly called species or varieties before any definition of these terms has been generally accepted is vain need to beat the air. Many of the cases of strongly marked varieties or doubtful species well deserve consideration. For several interesting lines of argument, from geographical distribution, analogical variation, hybridism, etc., have been brought to bear on the attempt to determine their rank. I will here give only a single instance, the well-known one of the primrose and cowslip, or Primula veris and eleator. These plants differ considerably in appearance. They have a different flavor and admit of different odor. They flower at slightly different periods. They grow in somewhat different stations. They ascend mountains to different heights. They have numerous geographical ranges, and lastly, according to very numerous experiments, made during several years by that most careful observer Gartner, they can be crossed only with much difficulty. We could hardly wish for better evidence of the two forms being specifically distinct. On the other hand, they are united by many intermediate links, and it is very doubtful whether these links are hybrids. And there is, as it seems to me, an overwhelming amount of experimental evidence showing that they descend from common parents, and consequently must be ranked as varieties. Close investigation in most cases will bring naturalists to an agreement how to rank doubtful forms. Yet it must be confessed that it is in the best known countries that we find the greatest number of forms of doubtful value. I have been struck with the fact that if any animal plant in a state of nature be highly useful to man, or from any cause closely attract his attention, varieties of it will almost universally be found recorded. These varieties, moreover, will often be ranked by some authors as species. Look at the common oak, how closely it has been studied. Yet a German author makes more than a dozen species out of forms, which are very generally considered as varieties. And in this country, the highest botanical authorities and practical men can be quoted to show that the sessile and pedunculated oaks are either good and distinct species or mere varieties. When a young naturalist commences the study of a group of organisms quite unknown to him, he is at first much perplexed to determine what differences to consider as specific and what as varieties, for he knows nothing of the amount and kind of variation to which the group is subject. And this shows at least how very generally there is some variation. But if he confine his attention to one class within one country, he will soon make up his mind how to rank most of the doubtful forms. His general tendency will be to make many species, or he will become impressed, just like the pigeon or poultry fancier before alluded to, with the amount of difference in the forms which he is continually studying. And he has little general knowledge of analogical variation in other groups and in other countries, by which to correct his first impressions. As he extends the range of his observations, he will meet with more cases of difficulty, for he will encounter a greater number of closely allied forms. But if his observations be widely extended, he will, in the end, generally be enabled to make up his own mind which to call varieties and which species. but he will succeed in this at the expense of admitting much variation, and in the truth of this admission will often be disputed by other naturalists. When, moreover, he comes to study allied forms brought from countries not now continuous, in which case he can hardly hope to find the intermediate links between his doubtful forms, he will have to trust almost entirely to analogy, and his difficulties will rise to a climax. Clearly no line of demarcation has as yet been drawn between species and subspecies. That is, the forms which in the opinion of some naturalists come very near to, but do not quite arrive at the rank of species, or again between subspecies and well-marked varieties, between lesser varieties and individual differences. These differences blend into each other in an insensible series, and a series impresses the mind with the idea of an actual passage. Hence I look at individual differences, though of small interest to the systematist, as of higher importance to us, as being the first step towards such varieties as are barely thought worth recording in works on natural history. And I look at varieties which are in any degree more distinct and permanent, as steps leading to more strongly marked and more permanent varieties, and at these latter as leaning to subspecies and to species. The passage from one stage of difference to another and higher stage may be in some cases due merely to the long-continued action of different physical conditions in two different regions. But I have not much faith in this view, and I attribute the passage of a variety from a state in which it differs very slightly from its parent to one in which it differs more, to the action of natural selection in accumulating, as will hereafter be more fully explained, differences of structure in certain definite directions. Hence, I believe a well-marked variety may be justly called an incipient species. But whether this belief be justifiable must be judged by the general weight of the several facts and views given throughout this work. It need not be supposed that all varieties or incipient species necessarily attain the rank of species. They may, whilst in this incipient state, become extinct, or they may endure as varieties for very long periods, as has been shown to be the case by Mr. Wollaston in the varieties of certain fossil land shells in Madeira. If a variety were to flourish so as to exceed in numbers the parent species, it would then rank them as the species, and the species as the variety, or it might come to supplant and exterminate the parent species, or both might coexist and both rank as independent species. But we shall hereafter have to return to the subject. From these remarks it will be seen that I look at the term species as one arbitrarily given for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals closely resembling each other, and that it does not necessarily differ from the term variety, which is given to less distinct and more fluctuating forms. The term variety, again in comparison with mere individual differences, is also applied arbitrarily and for mere convenience sake. Guided by theoretical considerations, I thought that some interesting results might be obtained in regard to the nature and relations of the species which vary most, by tabulating all the varieties in several well-worn floras. At first this seemed a simple task, but Mr. H.C. Watson, to whom I am much indebted for valuable advice and assistance on this subject, soon convinced me that there were many difficulties, as did subsequently Dr. Hooker, even in stronger terms. I shall reserve for my future work the discussion of these difficulties, and the tables themselves of the proportional numbers of the varying species. Dr. Hooker permits me to add that after having carefully read my manuscript, and examined the tables, he thinks that the following statements are fairly well established. The whole subject, however, treated as it is necessarily here, with much brevity, is rather perplexing, and allusions cannot be avoided to the struggle for existence, divergence of character, and other questions hereafter to be discussed. De Candolle and others have shown that the plants, which have very wide ranges, generally present varieties. And this might have been expected, as they become exposed to diverse physical conditions. And as they come into competition, which, as we shall hereafter see, is a far more important circumstance, with different sets of organic beings. But my tables, further, show that in any limited country, the species which are most common, that is, abound most in individuals, and the species which are most widely diffused within their own country, and this is a different consideration from wide range, and to a certain extent from commonness, often give rise to varieties sufficiently well marked to have been recorded in botanical works. Hence it is the most flourishing, or as they may be called, the dominant species, those which range widely over the world, are the most diffused in their own country, and are the most numerous in individuals, which oftenest produce well-marked varieties, or as I consider them, incipient species. And this perhaps might have been anticipated, for, as varieties, in order to become in any degree permanent, necessarily have to struggle with the other inhabitants of the country. The species which are already dominant will be most likely to yield offspring, which, though in some slight degree modified, will still inherit those advantages that enabled their parents to become dominant over their compatriots. If the plants inhabiting a country, and described in any flora, be divided into two equal masses, all those in the larger genera being placed on one side and all those in the smaller genera on the other, a somewhat larger number of the very common and much diffused or dominant species will be found on the side of the larger genera. Then again might have been anticipated, for the mere fact of many species of the same genus inhabiting any country shows that there is something in the organic or inorganic conditions of that country favorable to the genus, and consequently we might have expected to have found in the larger genera, all those including many species, a large proportional number of dominant species. But so many causes tend to obscure this result, that I am surprised that my tables show even a small majority on the side of the larger genera. I will here allude to only two cases of obscurity. Freshwater and saltwater living plants have generally very wide ranges, and are much diffused. But this seems to be connected with the nature of the stations inhabited by them, and has little or no relation to the size of the genera to which the species belong. Again, plants low in the scale of organization are generally much more widely diffused than plants higher in the scale. And here again there is no close relation to the size of the genera. The cause of lowly organized plants ranging widely will be discussed in our chapter on geographical distribution. From looking at species as only strongly marked and well-defined varieties, I was led to anticipate that the species of the larger genera in each country would oftener present varieties than the species of the smaller genera. For wherever many closely related species, i.e. species of the same genus, have been formed, many varieties or incipient species ought, as a general rule, to be now forming. Where many large trees grow, we expect to find saplings. Where many species of a genus have been formed through variation, circumstances have been favorable for variation, and hence we might expect that the circumstances would generally still be favorable to variation. On the other hand, if we look at each species as a special act of creation, there is no apparent reason why more varieties should occur in a group having many species than in one having few. To test the truth of this anticipation, I have arranged the plants of 12 countries and the coleopterous insects of 2 districts into 2 nearly equal masses. The species of the larger genera on one side and those of the smaller genera on the other side. And it has invariably proved to be the case that a larger proportion of the species on the side of the larger genera present varieties than on the side of the smaller genera. Moreover, the species of the larger genera which present any varieties invariably present a large average of number of varieties than do the species of the smaller genera. Both of these results follow when another division is made, and when all the smallest genera, with from only 1 to 4 species, are absolutely excluded from the tables. These facts are of plain signification on the view that species are only strongly marked and permanent varieties. For wherever many species of the same genus have been formed, or where, if we may use the expression, the manufactory of species has been active, we ought generally to find the manufactory still in action. More especially as we have every reason to believe the process of manufacturing new species to be a slow one. And this certainly is the case, if varieties be looked on as incipient species. For my tables clearly show as a general rule that wherever many species of a genus have been formed, the species of that genus present a number of varieties, that is, of incipient species beyond the average. It is not that all the larger genera are now varying much, and are thus increasing in the number of their species, or that no small genera are now varying and increasing. For if this had been so, it would have been fatal to my theory, inasmuch as geology plainly tells us that smaller genera have in the lapse of time often increased greatly in size, and that large genera have often come to their maxima, declined, and disappeared. All that we want to show is that where many species of a genus have been formed, on average many are still forming, and this holds good. There are other relations between the species of large genera and their recorded varieties which deserve notice. We have seen that there is no infallible criterion by which to distinguish species and well-marked varieties, and in those cases which intermediate links have not been found between doubtful forms, naturalists are compelled to come to determination by the amount of difference between them, judging by analogy whether or not the amount suffices to raise one or both to the rank of species. Hence, the amount of difference is one very important criterion in settling whether 2 forms should be ranked as species or varieties. Now, Fries has remarked in regard to plants, and Westwood in regard to insects, that in large genera the amount of difference between the species is often exceedingly small. I have endeavored to test this numerically by averages, and as far as my imperfect results go, they always confirm the view. I have also consulted some sagacious and most experienced observers, and, after deliberation, they concur in this view. In this respect, therefore, the species of the larger genera resemble varieties, more than do the species of the smaller genera. Or the case may be put in another way, and it may be said that in the larger genera, in which a number of varieties or incipient species greater than the average are now manufacturing, many of the species already manufactured still to a certain extent resemble varieties, for they differ from each other by a less than usual amount of difference. Moreover, the species of the large genera are related to each other, in the same manner the varieties of any one species are related to each other. No naturalist pretends that all the species of a genus are equally distinct from each other. They may generally be divided into subgenera or sections or lesser groups. As Fries has well remarked, little groups of species are generally clustered like satellites around certain other species. And what are varieties but groups of forms, unequally related to each other, and clustered around certain forms, that is, around their parent species? Undoubtedly, there is one more important point of difference between varieties and species, namely that the amount of difference between varieties, when compared with each other, or with their parent species, is much less than that between the species of the same genus. But when we come to discuss the principle, as I call it, of divergence of character, we shall see how this may be explained, and how the lesser differences between varieties will tend to increase into the greater differences between species. There is one other point which seems to me worth notice. Varieties generally have much restricted ranges. The statement is indeed scarcely more than a truism, for if a variety were found to have wider range than that of its supposed parent species, their denominations ought to be reversed. But there is also reason to believe that those species which are very closely allied to other species, and insofar resemble varieties, often have much restricted ranges. For instance, Mr. H.C. Watson has marked for me in the well-sifted London Catalogue of Plants, 4th edition, 63 plants which are therein ranked as species, but which he considers as so closely allied to other species as to be of doubtful value. These 63 reputed species range on an average over 6.9 of the provinces, into which Mr. Watson has divided Great Britain. Now in the same catalogue, 53 acknowledged varieties are recorded, and these range over 7.7 provinces, whereas the species to which these varieties belong range over 14.3 provinces, so that the acknowledged varieties have very nearly the same restricted average range as of those very closely allied forms, marked for me by Mr. Watson as doubtful species, but which are almost universally ranked by British botanists as good and true species. Finally, then, varieties have the same general characters as species, for they cannot be distinguished from species, except, firstly, by the discovery of intermediate linking forms, and the occurrence of such links cannot affect the actual characters of the forms which they connect, and except, secondly, by a certain amount of difference. For two forms, if differing very little, are generally ranked as varieties, notwithstanding that intermediate linking forms have not been discovered. But the amount of difference considered necessary to give to two forms the rank of species is quite indefinite. In genera having more than the average number of species in any country, the species of these genera have more than the average number of varieties. In large genera, the species are apt to be closely but unequally allied together, forming little clusters around certain species. Species very closely allied to other species have restricted ranges. In all these several respects, the species of large genera present a strong analogy with the varieties. And as we can clearly understand these analogies, the species have once existed as varieties and have thus originated, whereas these analogies are utterly inexplicable if each species has been independently created. We have also seen that it is the most flourishing and dominant species of the larger genera which on average vary most, and varieties, as we shall hereafter see, tend to become converted into new and distinct species. The larger genera thus tend to become larger, and throughout nature the forms of life which are now dominant tend to become still more dominant, by leaving many modified and dominant descendants. But by steps hereafter to be explained, the larger genera also tend to break up into smaller genera, and thus the forms of life throughout the universe become divided into groups, subordinate to groups. And after that very long boring waffle, we've reached the end of a chapter, so I'm going to call it there. As always, if you'd like to pick up where we've left off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.